This is a video lesson for the conditions for Q to Q before we start into the tests and other things where we have to take a look at where biases might lie. So looking at the same problem you had in your practice homework assignment last night with the chirps per second and temperature. You can see the data set here. If you don't have that in your calculator already from last night's homework, go ahead and enter it in again, and we're going to be referencing, there's a green box on page 636 in the book talking about the guidelines for regression inference. So if these are not met, the test results may not be reliable. Let's just review those conditions real quick. First one is that the scatter plot must be linear. So when you look at the shape of it, it has to look linear. We discussed that earlier this year. As you can see, I have the data values already in here. List 1 is my x values, chirps per second. List 2 is the temperature. And I have it set up already that when I go into graph F1, and I'm going to set this so that all three graphs are going to be used, and I'll explain that as I go here. But when I go into set F6, graph 1, I want to be a scatter plot. So let's exit back out. We're going to go F1. Graph 1, yeah, that's roughly linear. So I've met the first condition. Second condition, sample size has to be big enough. Okay, we've talked about that a lot this year. Got to make sure the sample size is big enough, specifically for the y values. You need to make sure the y values have no skewness, because think about what happens. If the y values are not normally distributed, then what we're talking about is having something that's really off base up here, and now we're talking about having something like an outlier or even a influential observation, and both of those can throw off the results of a test. So we're going to be looking at a histogram of the y values for any skewness especially. So again, I'm going to go into graph, and I have graph 1 set up as a scatter plot, and I'm going to change my settings, and instead of changing back and forth between these graphs every single time, I'm going to go to graph 2. So with that top line highlighted, I'm going to press F2 to go to graph 2. Now I'm in graph 2, and I'm going to set it up to be a histogram of list 2, which is where my y values are. So when I go back here, and I have graph 2, and I'm going to start at 60 with a width of 5. And when I draw that, yeah, that looks roughly normal. No major skewness. It's a little rough around the edges, but nothing overly concerning. The third condition says the response values have to have a constant spread over the x values. So as the x values go, y has to be somewhat constant. This is actually going to look for influential observations. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at outliers in the box plots of the residuals. So in this setting, I'm going to go to graph 3, and I'm going to set graph 3 up as a box plot for list 3, which is my residuals. Now, you have to run the regression equation for those residuals to show up. So you're going to have to get your regression equation, either run a test or run a calculation for those residuals to pop up in list 3. And we're going to take the box plot of list 3. You can see my residuals here. And when I take a look at, here, let's go through this real quick, just to make sure, before you do that, make sure that you run a calculation for regression, what we talked about yesterday, for that, so that you have the correct residuals in there, so that when you run it and you have a graph for graph 3, and you can see the residuals there, and you can see this goes down a little lower, but there's no outliers, there's nothing crazy happening. So when I look at my settings once more, make sure you have the outliers turned on so it will clearly show you that there's an outlier for graph 3 for the box plot. And so I've met all those conditions. The last condition is the data set was selected randomly and independently, and there's nothing in this problem to tell us anything different. So we're going to ask a series of questions. First of all, you already calculated the regression line, so we're not going to do that again. So we're going to look at this for each one of these. Did we meet it? Yes, the scatter plot looked linear. The histogram of the y values, and we ran that through. Yes, it looked roughly normal. We take a look at the box plot of the residuals. There are no outliers. And as far as we know, it's random and independent. So you're just going to do a little bit of practice, just going over these conditions to be met before we start into some more of the test tomorrow.